Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that might seem simple at first. What does it take to build a civilization? Most of us would probably answer with the usual suspects: agriculture, cities, writing, maybe bronze or iron tools. But what if I told you there was a culture that thrived for longer than all of recorded history, creating sophisticated art, permanent settlements, and complex spiritual traditions, all without planting a single seed? Ask her. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious whether you're settling in for the night or listening during the day. If you've got experience with archaeology, or remember when Japan was just emerging from the shadows of World War II and nobody was talking about their ancient history, I'd especially love to hear your stories down below. Your generation lived through history that younger folks only read about. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're standing in modern Japan, maybe on the northern island of Hokkaido, watching archaeologists carefully brush away dirt from what looks like an impossibly ornate piece of pottery. The vessel is covered in raised coils that seem to flame upward from its rim, twisted and elaborate in ways that seem almost baroque. The archaeologist carefully carbon dates a piece of charcoal found near the pottery. The result comes back 14,000 years old. 14,000 years! That's not a typo. This pottery predates the pyramids by 10,000 years. It predates Stonehenge. It predates agriculture itself in most of the world. And it's not simple pottery. It's sophisticated, artistic, deliberately complex. Welcome to the Jomon period, a chapter of human history so long and so strange that it challenges everything we think we know about how civilizations develop. For those of you who studied anthropology back in college, or who remember when the archaeological establishment was absolutely certain that pottery and permanent settlements required agriculture, this is going to mess with some deeply held assumptions. Spoiler, they were wrong. The Jomon people lived in what is now Japan for a staggering length of time, from approximately 14,000 BCE to about 300 BCE. Let me put that in perspective. The entire span of recorded human history, from the first Sumerian cuneiform tablets to right now, is only about 5,000 years. The Jomon period was 3 times longer than that. 3 times. These people maintained a coherent cultural tradition, making similar pottery styles, living in similar dwellings, following similar spiritual practices for longer than the gap between us and ancient Rome, Egypt, and Mesopotamia combined. And here's the thing that makes this truly remarkable. They did it all as hunter-gatherers. No farms, no domesticated animals except dogs. No irrigation canals or granaries or plows. Just an incredibly sophisticated understanding of their environment and a lifestyle so successful that they saw no reason to change it for 10 millennia. For those of you who served in the Pacific Theater or who remember the occupation of Japan after the war, the Japan you knew was already ancient. But even that 1,000-year tradition of samurai and emperors was just the most recent chapter. Beneath it lay the Yayoi period, the first agricultural peoples who arrived from the mainland. And beneath that, stretching back into the mists of the last ice age, were the Jomon, the first Japanese, the original inhabitants, a people whose story makes the samurai look like Johnny-come-latellies. Let's set the stage properly, because understanding the Jomon requires understanding just how different their world was from ours. When the Jomon culture began, around 14,000 BCE, the Earth was just emerging from the last ice age. Sea levels were dramatically lower, in some places 300 feet lower than today. Japan wasn't quite the collection of islands we know now. It was connected to the Asian mainland by land bridges. You could walk from what is now Hokkaido into Siberia. The Korea Strait was partially dry land. The climate was cold, but warming. The landscape was changing rapidly in geological terms. Forests spreading, coastlines retreating as glaciers melted, sea levels rising. The ancestors of the Jomon people witnessed environmental changes that would make modern climate debates look tame. Within a few thousand years, the sea would swallow hundreds of miles of coastal plains, drowning the hunting grounds and forcing communities to adapt or perish. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where the Jomon made choices that set them apart from almost every other culture on Earth. As the climate warmed and the landscape changed, they didn't panic. They didn't develop agriculture out of desperation. They adapted their hunter-gatherer lifestyle to take advantage of the new abundance. Because here's what most people don't realize about Japan during this period. It was a paradise for hunter-gatherers, absolutely ideal. The warming climate created vast deciduous forests filled with nut-bearing trees: oak, chestnut, horse chestnut, walnut, beech. The rivers teemed with salmon. The coasts offered endless shellfish, sea mammals, and fish. The forests hosted deer, wild boar, and smaller game. It was an environment so rich in natural resources that permanent settlements became not just possible, but practical. Think about that for a moment. In most of the world, hunter-gatherers had to move constantly, following game herds and seasonal plants. Stay in one place too long, and you'd deplete the local resources. But in Jomon, Japan, the resources were so abundant and so reliable that communities could settle down, build permanent houses, and stay put for generations. They got all the benefits of sedentary life: accumulated possessions, complex social structures, artistic development, without needing to farm. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge something that the generation watching this understands instinctively. Abundance doesn't automatically mean ease. Those of you who grew up during the Depression, or who remember the hard years after the war when everything was rationed, you know that having resources and knowing how to use them are two very different things. The Jomon weren't lounging in paradise. They were working incredibly hard, developing techniques to process chestnuts and acorns that required days of leaching to remove the bitter tannins. They were building fish weirs, setting traps, tracking game, predicting seasonal migrations of salmon, managing their resources carefully enough that those resources would still be there next year and the year after that. This wasn't lazy abundance. This was sophisticated resource management practiced over thousands of years, passed down through oral tradition, refined through trial and error by hundreds of generations. They knew their environment the way a master craftsman knows his tools, intimately, precisely. with a depth of understanding that would take a modern botanist or zoologist years to match. And they figured something else out too, something that would take European cultures thousands more years to understand. You don't need to own land to manage it. The Jomon practiced what we'd now call landscape engineering. Without agriculture, they encouraged the growth of useful plants. They might clear underbrush to make it easier to gather chestnuts. They definitely used control burns to maintain open areas that attracted game. They planted groves of useful trees near their settlements. This was sophisticated environmental management, just not agriculture as we typically define it. Those who remember the Civilian Conservation Corps, or who worked with forestry programs in the 30s and 40s, will recognize this approach. Managing land without dominating it, working with nature's patterns rather than against them. The Jomon understood this instinctively, thousands of years before it became a formal science. Now we come to what archaeologists call the Jomon paradox, and it's a puzzle that bothered scholars for decades. How do you explain permanent villages, sophisticated pottery, complex art, social stratification, and ceremonial architecture in a hunter-gatherer society? According to the textbooks that were standard when many of you were in school, these things required agriculture. Period. No farming, no civilization. That was the rule. The Jomon broke that rule so thoroughly that when their sites were first properly excavated in the early 20th century, archaeologists couldn't agree on how to classify them. Some insisted they must have practiced agriculture. They just hadn't found the evidence yet. Others argued that the pottery and villages proved nothing, that these were just unusually elaborate hunter-gatherers. The debate got quite heated in academic circles, which for archaeologists means strongly worded footnotes and pointed remarks at conferences. Turns out they were both wrong, or rather, both partly right. The Jomon were elaborate hunter-gatherers, but so elaborate that they essentially created a hybrid lifestyle that doesn't fit neatly into the categories we use. They had permanent villages, yes. They had social complexity, absolutely. They had art, ceremony, trade networks spanning hundreds of miles. They had everything except farms. Let's talk specifics, because the details here are remarkable. Jomon settlements ranged from small hamlets of 3 or 4 houses to substantial villages of 30 or more dwellings, housing perhaps 200 people. These weren't temporary camps. We're talking about houses built to last, rebuilt in the same location generation after generation. Some villages show continuous occupation for over 1,000 years. That's longer than most modern American towns have existed. The houses themselves were ingenious pieces of engineering. They were pit dwellings, partially sunken structures that took advantage of the Earth's natural insulation. You'd dig a pit about 3 to 4 feet deep and anywhere from 12 to 30 feet across, depending on how many people needed to live there. Vertical wooden posts around the perimeter and in the interior supported a framework of horizontal beams and rafters. The whole thing was covered with bark, grass thatch, or woven grass mats. More earth was piled around the base for additional insulation. Inside, you'd find a central hearth, usually lined with stones to retain heat and protect the earth floor from the fire. Around the hearth, the daily life of a Jomon household unfolded. People sat on the earthen floor, often on woven mats or furs. They cooked, ate, crafted tools, made pottery, repaired fishing equipment, told stories, raised children. Those of you who remember visiting relatives in rural areas before electricity became universal might have some sense of what life centered around a fire feels like. Everything happens in that circle of warmth and light. Beyond it is darkness and cold. Now, here's where it gets interesting from an engineering standpoint. These pit dwellings were brilliantly adapted to the Japanese climate. The partial burial provided excellent insulation. The earth stays relatively stable in temperature year-round. In summer, the pit stayed cooler than the air above. In winter, the combination of the central fire and earth insulation kept the interior remarkably warm. Smoke from the fire rose naturally to the roof opening, which also provided ventilation. It was simple, effective, and required only materials that were readily available. Different regions and time periods showed variations in design. Some Jomon houses were quite large. Evidence suggests extended families living together. Some had storage pits dug into the floor for keeping dried fish, nuts, or other preserved foods. Some communities in the later Jomon period built raised floor structures for storage, keeping food supplies dry and away from rodents. This wasn't primitive architecture. This was thoughtful, sophisticated design that worked extremely well for its purpose. But architecture is only part of the story. What really made permanent settlement possible for the Jomon was their mastery of storage and food preservation. In agricultural societies, you store grain in granaries. The Jomon stored nuts, dried fish, dried meat, and processed plant foods. They developed sophisticated techniques for processing and preserving food that would last through the winter months when gathering was impossible. Acorns and chestnuts could be dried and stored for months. Fish could be smoked or dried. Venison could be preserved. They probably fermented some foods, though the evidence for that is circumstantial. The point is, they solved the fundamental challenge that keeps most hunter-gatherers mobile: how to eat during lean seasons without moving to follow food sources. And they solved it well enough that they could afford to invest time and energy in things that weren't strictly necessary for survival. They could make beautiful pottery. They could create elaborate ceremonial objects. They could develop complex spiritual practices. They could specialize, some people becoming particularly skilled at certain crafts, others at hunting or fishing, others perhaps at shamanic or leadership roles. You don't get specialization in a society that's living hand to mouth, constantly on the move. You only get it when there's surplus, stability, and time. Those who remember the war years, when every bit of food mattered and nothing was wasted, will understand what I'm describing. The Jomon lived with that same careful attention to resources, that same mentality of waste not, want not, but they did it by choice, as a successful lifestyle, not as desperation. They had abundance, but they respected it enough to manage it carefully. Now, let's talk about the pottery, because this is where the Jomon truly distinguished themselves as artists of the first order. When I say they made some of the world's oldest pottery, I'm not talking about crude bowls or simple cups. I'm talking about vessels so elaborate, so deliberately artistic, that they served no practical purpose whatsoever. Pure art, created by people who, supposedly, hadn't yet figured out farming. The name Jomon literally means cord-marked, referring to the distinctive patterns these people pressed into their pottery. They'd wrap cord around a stick or paddle and press it into the wet clay before firing, creating textured geometric patterns. Simple enough in concept, but what the Jomon did with this basic technique was anything but simple. The earliest Jomon pottery, from around 14,000 BCE, was relatively straightforward. Deep cooking pots with rounded bottoms designed to sit in fires. Functional, practical, the kind of thing you'd expect from people learning a new technology. But within a few thousand years, Jomon potters were creating vessels that defy explanation in purely functional terms. Take the so-called flame-style pottery from the Middle Jomon period, around 3000 to 2000 BCE. These vessels have rims that explode upward in elaborate raised coils, spirals, and projections that look like frozen flames or ocean waves. Some of these decorative elements extend 6 inches or more above the rim of the pot itself. Imagine trying to actually use such a vessel for cooking or storage. You couldn't. The elaborate rim would make it nearly impossible to handle when full, impossible to cover, and generally impractical for any utilitarian purpose. So why make them? That's the question that's puzzled archaeologists for decades. Were they ceremonial, religious objects, status symbols, art for art's sake? We don't know. The Jomon left us their pottery, but not their explanation for it. All we can say with certainty is that by the Middle Jomon period, these people were producing ceramic art that wouldn't look out of place in a modern art museum. In fact, many pieces are in modern art museums, and they hold their own quite nicely next to contemporary sculpture. The technical skill required to create these vessels was extraordinary. Jomon potters used the coil method, building up the walls of the pot by stacking rings of clay and then smoothing them together. For a simple pot, this is straightforward, but for the elaborate flame-style vessels, you're building complex three-dimensional sculptures while simultaneously managing the weight and structural integrity of wet clay. Get the moisture content wrong, and it collapses. Get the thickness inconsistent, and it cracks during firing. Rush the drying process, and it warps. And then there's the firing process. The Jomon didn't have kilns. They fired their pottery in open bonfires, which meant controlling temperature was nearly impossible. You dig a shallow pit, arrange the dried pottery, stack wood around and over it, and light it on fire. The fire needed to burn hot enough, long enough, to transform the clay chemically, but not so hot that everything exploded or melted. Wind direction mattered. Wood moisture mattered. Where you placed each pot in the fire mattered. It was more art than science, and the failure rate must have been devastating. Those of you who've done any pottery work, even with modern kilns and controlled temperatures, know how heartbreaking it is to lose a piece you've invested hours into. Imagine putting weeks or months into creating an elaborate flame-style vessel, only to have it shatter in the fire because the wind shifted at the wrong moment. And yet, the Jomon persisted. They got good at it, very good. The majority of pottery we find in archaeological sites is intact or reconstructible, which suggests they had mastered the variables involved in open firing. Different regions developed different styles. The eastern Jomon, in what's now the Kanto region around modern Tokyo, favored the elaborate flame styles. Western Jomon pottery tended to be more restrained, with simpler forms and decoration. Northern Jomon in Hokkaido developed their own distinctive patterns, but all of it shared certain characteristics: cord marking, careful craftsmanship, and an artistic sensibility that went far beyond mere utility. The question archaeologists love to debate: did the pottery reflect spiritual beliefs? Almost certainly, yes. Many vessels show what appear to be deliberately symbolic designs, spirals that might represent water or infinity, snake motifs, what could be stylized human or animal forms worked into the clay. Some pots have faces modeled onto them, with coffee bean-shaped eyes and open mouths. Others have breasts or other body parts incorporated into the design. This wasn't random decoration. This was meaning, even if we've lost the specific meanings they intended. And here's something worth considering. The amount of time and energy the Jomon invested in creating elaborate pottery tells us something important about their society. You only get art like this in a culture with surplus, not surplus food necessarily. We've established they weren't farming, but surplus time and energy. If every moment of every day is consumed with basic survival, nobody's making flame-style pottery. The existence of these vessels is indirect evidence that Jomon life, while certainly hard by our standards, wasn't desperate. They had breathing room. They had leisure time, or at least some members of the community did. This probably means some level of social stratification. Maybe certain families or individuals were recognized as particularly skilled potters and were supported by the community, so they could focus on their craft. Maybe pottery making was a seasonal activity, done during winter months when hunting and gathering slowed down. Maybe it was a communal activity with religious or social significance beyond the objects themselves. We're speculating, but these are educated guesses based on how other pre-industrial societies function. But pottery wasn't the only material the Jomon mastered. Let's talk about stone tools, because here again we see sophistication that challenges our assumptions about primitive peoples. The Jomon were expert knappers. That's the technical term for making stone tools by striking flakes off a larger piece of rock. It's a skill that takes years to master, requiring an intuitive understanding of how stone fractures, where to strike, how hard, at what angle. The basic Jomon toolkit included knives, scrapers, projectile points for spears and arrows, axes, and grinding stones. These weren't crude implements. A well-made Jomon knife, with its carefully pressure-flaked edge, could be as sharp as a modern steel blade. Sharper, actually, in the sense that obsidian, volcanic glass that the Jomon prized for tools can be flaked to an edge only a few molecules thick. Surgeons today sometimes use obsidian scalpels for exactly this reason. They're sharper than steel, they make cleaner cuts, and they reduce tissue trauma. The Jomon knew this 10,000 years ago. Obsidian was valuable enough that it became a trade good. There are only certain volcanic regions where high-quality obsidian occurs naturally. Archaeological evidence shows obsidian tools found hundreds of miles from their source, meaning The Jomon had established trade networks that moved goods across the Japanese archipelago. This implies not just contact between different groups, but sustained, organized trade relationships. You don't trade with strangers casually. You trade with peoples you trust, with whom you've established protocols, maybe even kinship connections through marriage. Stone axes required even more sophisticated manufacturing. A good, polished stone axe started with selecting the right type of rock, something hard and durable, usually basalt or a similar volcanic stone. You'd rough out the basic shape through percussion flaking, then spend hours, maybe days, grinding and polishing it on sandstone or other abrasive rock, using water as a lubricant. The result was a tool that could fell trees, shape wood, and last for years or even decades of hard use. We know the Jomon valued these axes because we find them in graves, carefully placed with the deceased. That tells us axes weren't just functional tools. They were status symbols, valuable possessions worth taking into the afterlife. Some axes show evidence of repeated resharpening and repair, suggesting they were curated objects passed down through generations. Your grandfather's axe, still serving the family decades after he'd gone to join the ancestors. For those of you who remember when hand tools were made to last, when you'd buy something once and expect it to serve you for life, this will resonate. The Jomon lived that ethos by necessity, but also, it seems, by choice. Quality mattered. Craftsmanship mattered. Taking pride in work well done mattered. These weren't throwaway tools. They were investments of time, skill, and cultural value. And then there are the shell middens, which sounds like a technical term, but really just means garbage heaps full of shells. The Jomon ate enormous quantities of shellfish, and they threw the shells in massive piles near their settlements. These middens can be 20 feet deep, representing centuries or even millennia of accumulated dinner refuse. Now you might think, garbage heaps, who cares? But archaeologists love middens, the way prospectors love gold strikes. Shells preserve beautifully, and the alkaline chemistry of all that calcium carbonate actually preserves materials that would normally decay. Bone, wood, fiber, antler. We've recovered Jomon fish hooks made from bone and shell, wooden tools, fiber cordage, even preserved plant remains that tell us exactly what they were eating. The middens are time capsules, layer after layer of daily life preserved for modern analysis. One particular shell midden in Hokkaido, the Karitabaru site, is over 200 feet long and 15 feet deep. 15 feet of shells, soil, and artifacts. When you stand next to it, you're looking at thousands of years of human activity. Generation after generation, living in the same place, eating the same foods, throwing the shells in the same spot. It's almost overwhelming when you think about the continuity represented there. Your great, 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 great. Multiply that by 100 grandparents ate oysters and threw the shells on that pile. So did every generation between them and the present. Those of you who've lived in the same community for decades, who remember when your neighbor's grandparents were still alive, might have some small sense of what that kind of continuity feels like. But the Jomon continuity, stretched across time scales we can barely comprehend. Analysis of these shell middens reveals something else interesting. The Jomon were careful not to over-harvest. The shells show a consistent size distribution over thousands of years, suggesting they were taking shellfish at a sustainable rate. Compare this to many modern fisheries, where the average size of caught fish has decreased over just decades due to overfishing. The Jomon managed their resources with a longer view. They understood, intuitively if not scientifically, that if you take everything this year, there's nothing next year. This is yet another example of their sophistication. Not technological sophistication in the sense of machines or written language, but ecological sophistication. They'd figured out how to live in their environment sustainably for 10,000 years. That's not primitive. That's advanced. Most modern industrial societies haven't managed sustainable resource use for even 200 years. I'm curious what you think about this. We like to think of progress as linear, primitive to advanced, simple to complex. But the Jomon challenge that narrative. In some ways, they were more advanced than us, at least in terms of long-term sustainability. Do you agree with that assessment? Or am I romanticizing a difficult life? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely interested in your perspectives, especially those of you who remember when conservation wasn't just an environmental buzzword, but a necessity. Beyond stone and clay, the Jomon also worked bone, antler, and wood extensively. Bone fish hooks, antler harpoon points, wooden bows, fiber nets, all the technology needed for their aquatic-focused lifestyle. Many of these items show not just functional design, but artistic embellishment. A fish hook doesn't need to be carved with geometric patterns to work, but many Jomon fish hooks were decorated anyway. That impulse to make things beautiful, even when beauty isn't strictly necessary, is deeply human. It's also, again, evidence of a society with enough surplus that pure aesthetics mattered. The Jomon were particularly skilled at working with plant fibers. They made baskets, nets, cordage, and textiles from a variety of plants. We know this partly from rare preserved examples, but also from the impressions left in clay. They'd sometimes set wet pottery on woven mats to dry, and the matte texture would transfer to the bottom of the pot. From these impressions, we can reconstruct their weaving techniques, which were surprisingly sophisticated. They used multiple weaving patterns, understood tension and structure, and created containers that were both functional and aesthetically pleasing. Basketry is one of those crafts that looks simple until you try it. Getting the tension right, keeping the pattern consistent, creating a shape that's structurally sound, it takes practice. Lots of practice. The fact that Jomon baskets show such refinement suggests again that they had specialists, people who'd spent years mastering the craft, who understood the properties of different fibers, who knew which plants to harvest when and how to process them. All of this, the pottery, the stone tools, the bone implements, the woven goods, represents an enormous accumulated body of knowledge. Each technique had to be discovered, refined, passed down through generations. Think about what it takes to figure out from scratch how to make a waterproof basket. Which plants work? How do you process them? What weaving pattern provides the necessary tightness? It's not intuitive. It requires experimentation, failure, persistence, and memory. The Jomon preserved and transmitted this knowledge through oral tradition, demonstration, and hands-on teaching. In a society without writing, knowledge is embodied in people, in the skilled craftsperson who teaches the next generation, in the elder who remembers how things were done in their grandfather's time, in the child who watches carefully and learns by imitating. This makes knowledge both precious and fragile. If the skilled basket maker dies before teaching someone, that knowledge can die with them, but it didn't die. The continuity of Jomon material culture over 10,000 years proves they had effective systems for teaching and learning, for preserving crucial knowledge across generations. That's its own kind of technology, social technology, if you will. They'd figured out how to maintain cultural continuity without books, schools, or written records. Just human memory, human observation, and human dedication to preserving what matters. Now we enter territory that's even more mysterious, more open to interpretation, and frankly, more fascinating. The spiritual world of the Jomon. And nothing embodies that mystery quite like the Dogo figurines. If you've never seen a Dogu, they're distinctive. Imagine a clay human figure, usually between 4 and 12 inches tall, with an enormous head, large gobble-like eyes, a small body often showing exaggerated feminine characteristics, and covered head to toe in elaborate decorative patterns. Some have what look like spacesuits or elaborate clothing. Some have snake-like decorations. Some appear to be pregnant. Many are deliberately broken, smashed, and then carefully buried. There are thousands of these figurines scattered across Jomon sites, and we have absolutely no idea what they were for. None. Zero. We can speculate, and scholars have speculated extensively, but the truth is, the Jomon took their explanations to the grave. The most popular theory is that they were fertility figures, representations of mother goddesses, or spirits associated with childbirth and abundance. The emphasis on breasts, hips, and sometimes pregnant bellies supports this interpretation. In many traditional societies, fertility, both human and agricultural, is central to religious practice. Children mean survival. Full bellies mean prosperity. It makes sense that people would create ritual objects focused on these concerns. But here's the problem. The Jomon weren't agricultural. They didn't need to pray for good harvests in the same way farming peoples did. Their fertility concerns would have been different. Healthy children, yes, but also abundant game, good fishing, plentiful nuts and shellfish. So maybe the Dogu represented something broader than agricultural fertility. Maybe they were generalized spirits of abundance or protectors of the community. Another theory, they were used in healing rituals. Some Dogu show what might be representations of illness or injury. The practice of deliberately breaking them might have been sympathetic magic, breaking the figurine to break the illness, then burying it to bury the sickness. We know many cultures have practiced similar rituals, where harm done to an image or representation affects the thing represented. Or maybe they were burial offerings, companions for the dead in the afterlife. Some Dogu are found in graves, but not all of them. Most are found in general settlement refuse or deliberately buried in pits by themselves. So burial offerings doesn't explain the majority of finds. The deliberate breakage is particularly intriguing. Many dogo are found with heads removed, limbs missing, or bodies snapped in half. This wasn't accidental damage. The breaks are too clean, too consistent. Someone deliberately destroyed these figurines, often soon after making them. Why create something elaborate only to smash it? This is where archaeology reaches its limits. We can describe what we find. We can measure, categorize, and analyze. But motivation, belief, meaning, these things don't preserve in the soil. They exist only in human minds, transmitted through language and culture. When a culture disappears or transforms, those meanings can be lost forever. Those of you who've experienced the loss of elders in your own families, who've wished you'd asked more questions about the old ways before it was too late, you understand this kind of cultural loss. Once knowledge passes beyond living memory, it's extraordinarily difficult to recover. The Jomon had no writing. When their culture transformed into the Yayoi period, with the arrival of agriculture, much of their spiritual framework probably died with that transformation. Still, we can make some educated guesses based on patterns. The Dogu appear primarily in the middle to late Jomon period, reaching peak complexity and distribution around 2000 to 1000 BCE. This was also the period of maximum Jomon population and cultural elaboration. More people, more social complexity, perhaps more need for ritual objects that mediated between the human and spirit worlds. The care taken in making dogu also tells us something. These weren't quick, rough figures. They were carefully sculpted, decorated, and fired. Someone invested significant time in creating each one. That investment suggests importance. You don't spend hours on something trivial. The dogu mattered. They had value beyond their material substance. And there's regional variation in dogu styles, just as there was in pottery. Northern figurines differ from Eastern ones. Late Jomon dogu are more elaborate than early examples. This suggests the beliefs they represented evolved over time and varied by location. The Jomon spiritual world wasn't static or monolithic. It was dynamic, adaptive, regionally diverse, like the people themselves. Beyond the dogu, we have other evidence of Jomon's spiritual life. They buried their dead with care and ceremony, often in the fetal position, surrounded by grave goods, pottery, tools, ornaments. This suggests belief in an afterlife, or at least respect for the deceased that extended beyond death. Some burial sites show evidence of ritual feasting, perhaps commemorative meals shared by the living to honor the dead. Stone circles appear at some late Jomon sites, arrangements of standing stones that clearly required communal effort to create and likely served ceremonial purposes. These aren't as massive or famous as Stonehenge, but they're conceptually similar. People moving and arranging large stones for reasons that transcend pure utility. The stones mark sacred space, define ritual areas, perhaps align with celestial events. Again, we're speculating, but educated speculation based on how humans tend to use such structures. There's also evidence of shamanism, or at least specialized ritual practitioners. Some burials contain unusual items, collections of unusual stones, elaborate headdresses, concentrations of ritual objects, suggesting these individuals held special roles in their communities. Perhaps they were healers, spiritual leaders, or intermediaries with the spirit world. Most traditional hunter-gatherer societies have such individuals, people who've undergone special training or experienced visions that mark them as having special relationships with unseen forces. The Jomon worldview, like that of most non-agricultural peoples, probably didn't distinguish sharply between natural and supernatural. Everything was animated, alive, potentially sacred. The river had a spirit. The mountain had a spirit. The animals you hunted had spirits that needed to be respected and appeased. Disrespect could bring bad luck, poor hunting, illness, disaster. This isn't primitive superstition. It's sophisticated ecological ethics dressed in spiritual language. If you believe the salmon have spirits that must be honored, you're less likely to overfish them. If you believe the forest is sacred, you're more likely to treat it sustainably. Modern environmentalism is only just rediscovering what traditional peoples knew instinctively. You can't separate human well-being from environmental health. They're the same thing. The Jomon understood this. Their spiritual beliefs reinforced sustainable practices. Whether those beliefs were literally true in some metaphysical sense is irrelevant. They worked. They helped maintain a balance that lasted 10,000 years. To truly understand the Jomon, we need to walk through their year, season by season, because their entire lifestyle was built around intimate knowledge of seasonal patterns. Unlike agricultural societies where the year divides into planting, growing, and harvest, the Jomon calendar was more complex. A rotating schedule of when and where different resources became available, each requiring different skills, different tools, different locations. Spring in Jomon, Japan meant renewal and hard work. As the snow melted and temperatures warmed, the first edible plants appeared. Shoots, greens, roots that had overwintered. The rivers swelled with snowmelt, and with that water came the salmon, fighting their way upstream to spawn. This was crucial. Salmon runs represented a massive influx of protein that could be caught, smoked, and stored for later use. Entire communities would focus on fishing during these few critical weeks, working from dawn to dusk while the salmon were running. Picture the scene. Men and women both working in the cold water, some with spears, others with woven basket traps, positioned in the current to funnel fish into catching areas. Children running back and forth carrying fish to the processing stations, where others gutted, filleted, and hung the meat on wooden racks over smoky fires. It was communal effort, everyone contributing, because the window of opportunity was brief and the potential reward was enormous. Those of you who remember rationing during the war, or who grew up on farms where harvest time meant everybody worked, dawn to dusk with no days off, you understand this kind of seasonal intensity. When the resource is available, you take full advantage. You don't get a second chance. The salmon run for a few weeks, and then they're gone for another year. Miss that window and you've lost a major food source for the months ahead. Summer brought different opportunities. The forests filled with edible plants, berries, and the beginning of nut production. Deer were prime, well-fed on spring vegetation, their meat at its best. This was hunting season, when small groups of men would range into the forest for days at a time, tracking and taking game. The women and children, meanwhile, gathered plant foods, which required equally sophisticated knowledge. You can't just wander into a forest and grab random plants. Some are nutritious, some are inedible, some will kill you. The Jomon women, and it was primarily women who did the gathering, based on ethnographic parallels with other hunter-gatherer societies, had to know hundreds of plant species, which were safe, which parts were edible, when they were ready, how to process them, where they grew. This was a botanical education that would put many modern degrees to shame. Take acorns, for example. Oak trees produce massive quantities of acorns, a tremendous potential food source. But raw acorns are inedible. They're full of tannins that make them intensely bitter and can make you sick if you eat enough. The Jomon figured out how to process acorns through a laborious technique involving shelling, grinding, and repeated water leaching to remove the tannins. You'd shell the acorns, grind them into flour using stone tools, then soak that flour in running water for days, changing the water repeatedly until the bitterness was gone. What remained was a bland but nutritious flour that could be made into cakes or porridge. This is not intuitive knowledge. Someone, thousands of years ago, had to experiment. They had to figure out that water removes the bitter compounds. They had to develop the tools and techniques to do it efficiently. And then they had to teach the next generation. And that generation had to teach theirs, maintaining this knowledge across thousands of years. By the time we're looking at the Middle Jomon period, acorn processing was so refined, so embedded in the culture, that it was probably just how things were done. Knowledge so fundamental that it didn't need explanation. Fall was nut harvest season. Chestnuts, walnuts, horse chestnuts, all ripening at roughly the same time, creating a brief period of intense gathering. These nuts, unlike acorns, could be eaten with minimal processing and stored well through the winter. A good nut harvest meant the difference between comfortable winter and hungry winter. Communities probably had territorial agreements about which groves belonged to whom, though we can only speculate about how these arrangements worked. The intensity of fall harvest probably rivaled spring salmon runs. You'd have weeks, maybe a month or so, to gather, process, and store enough nuts to last through winter and into spring. Children would help. The elderly would help. Everyone who could work would work. And you'd be competing with animals. Bears, deer, wild boar, who wanted those same nuts for their own winter survival. Then came winter, the hardest season, but also, paradoxically, the season when permanent settlement showed its greatest advantage. While nomadic hunter-gatherers had to keep moving, following game herds south or to lower elevations, the Jomon could stay put. They'd spent spring, summer, and fall accumulating and preserving food. Now they could live on those stores, spending more time indoors around fires, doing maintenance work, crafting tools, making pottery, telling stories. Winter was probably when much of the elaborate artwork was created, when you can't hunt because of snow, when gathering is impossible, when fishing is limited by ice. That's when you have time for activities that aren't immediately related to food acquisition. Those beautiful flame-style pots were likely winter projects, created over days or weeks of careful work by firelight. But don't romanticize it. Winter was still brutal by modern standards. Imagine spending 4 months in a partially underground structure with minimal heating, wearing clothes made from animal hides and plant fibers that provided insulation, but nothing like modern materials. You'd be cold, not uncomfortable, cold. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and never quite leaves. Those of you who served in Korea during the winter of 9551, or who remember winters in unheated houses during the Depression, you have some reference point. But even then, you had more resources than the Jomon did. They survived through community solidarity. Families lived together, body heat helping warm the dwellings. They shared resources. If one family's stores ran short, others would help. They probably told stories, passing down oral history and teaching the next generation about techniques, about the spirits, about the land and its patterns. Knowledge transfer was a winter activity, when there was time to sit and talk, when elders could teach and young people could learn without the pressure of immediate survival tasks. The social structure that supported this lifestyle was sophisticated in ways that aren't immediately obvious from archaeology alone. The Jomon clearly had some form of social hierarchy, not rigid classes like later feudal Japan, a differentiation based on skill, age, family lineage, or spiritual authority. We see this in burial practices. Some graves contain more elaborate goods than others. Some individuals were buried with special items, suggesting they held special roles. Some burials show evidence of greater ceremony than others. But this wasn't oppressive hierarchy. The Jomon couldn't afford tyrants or exploitation. In a small community where everyone depends on everyone else, where survival requires cooperation, you can't have one person or family extracting resources from others without giving back. Leadership in such societies tends to be earned rather than inherited, based on demonstrated skill, wisdom, or spiritual power. The best hunter, the most skilled craftswoman, the wisest elder, the most powerful shaman. These people would have natural authority, but authority that came with responsibility to serve the community's needs. We can infer that elders held special status. Most traditional societies respect age because age means accumulated knowledge. You've lived through many cycles, survived many challenges, learned many lessons. An elder who remembered the terrible winter 30 years ago, or the techniques used to survive a salmon run failure, or the warning signs of coming storms. That person was walking library, a repository of survival information. You'd listen when they spoke. Women probably held significant authority, particularly in domestic and gathering realms. In most hunter-gatherer societies, gathered foods provide the majority of calories. Hunting is important, dramatic, and dangerous, but gathering is reliable. The woman who knows which plants are edible, where they grow, when they're ready, and how to process them is every bit as crucial to survival as the skilled hunter. More so, actually, because you can survive without meat easier than you can survive without plant foods. Children in Jomon society probably enjoyed considerable freedom by modern standards, but also started contributing to community welfare early. By age 5 or 6, children could gather easy-to-find foods like berries or shellfish. By 10 or 12, they'd be learning more specialized skills. Boys starting to hunt small game, girls processing foods and learning craft work. By late teens, they'd be fully productive members of the community, though still learning refinements from their elders. This doesn't mean childhood was joyless. Play is how young mammals, including humans, learn. Jomon children probably played games that taught hunting skills, ran around the village learning the landscape, explored the forest under watchful eyes, and generally lived the kind of outdoor childhood that's becoming rare in modern industrial societies. Those of you who grew up in the 20s and 30s, before suburban development and helicopter parenting, might remember that kind of freedom. Long days outside, coming home when hunger or darkness called, learning through experience rather than formal instruction. The Jomon also maintained extensive trade networks, which tells us they weren't isolated village communities, but part of broader social and economic connections. We find obsidian tools hundreds of miles from their source. We find shells from specific coastal regions in inland sites. We find pottery styles that show influence from distant areas. This means people were moving, goods were traveling, information was spreading. Trade meetings were probably scheduled events held at traditional locations at specific times of year. Coastal peoples might trade dried fish and shells for obsidian tools brought by inland peoples. Northern communities might trade furs and Arctic goods for southern pottery or plant materials. These meetings would be social events as much as economic ones, opportunities to find marriage partners from other groups, to share news and information, to cement alliances, perhaps to hold ceremonies together. Marriage between groups was probably crucial for maintaining peace and facilitating trade. If your daughter married into another community, you had kinship ties that discouraged conflict and encouraged cooperation. Anthropologists call this alliance building through marriage, and it's been practiced by humans worldwide for thousands of years. The Jomon almost certainly did the same. These marriage alliances would also have served another crucial function: genetic diversity. Small, isolated communities face inbreeding problems after a few generations. Regular exchange of marriage partners with other communities kept the gene pool healthy. The Jomon may not have understood genetics as we do, but they probably understood from experience that marrying distant relatives produced healthier children than marrying close relatives. The archaeological evidence suggests the Jomon population fluctuated over time, with periods of growth and decline. The early Jomon population was relatively small, perhaps a few tens of thousands, across the entire Japanese archipelago. By the Middle Jomon period, population had increased dramatically, maybe reaching 250,000 or more. Then, in the late Jomon, population declined again, though scholars debate why. Climate change probably played a role. The Middle Jomon coincided with the warmest period of the Holocene, the long warm interval we're still in today. Warmer temperatures meant more abundant forests, better nut crops, higher productivity. But then temperatures cooled slightly in the late Jomon. Not dramatically, nothing like an ice age, but enough to reduce forest productivity and make life harder. Overexploitation of resources may also have contributed. Even sophisticated resource management can fail if population grows beyond what the environment can sustainably support. The Jomon might have reached carrying capacity in some regions during the Middle Period, then suffered population decline as resources became scarcer. It's also possible that disease played a role, though we have limited evidence for specific epidemics. But here's the remarkable thing. Even with population fluctuations, even with challenging periods, the Jomon cultural tradition continued. For thousands of years, through climate shifts and population changes, they maintained their core lifestyle, their pottery traditions, their spiritual practices, their way of life. That's resilience on a timescale it's hard for us to fully comprehend. Around 900 BCE, something changed. Rice cultivation appeared in Japan, brought by people migrating from the Korean Peninsula and eventually China. These newcomers, who we call the Yayoi people, after the archaeological site where their culture was first identified, brought with them not just rice, but an entirely different way of life. Agriculture, permanent rice paddies, metallurgy, social hierarchies based on control of agricultural land. Everything the Jomon had successfully avoided for 10,000 years. The transition from Jomon to Yayoi culture is one of those fascinating historical moments where you can see two fundamentally different worldviews colliding. On one side, the Jomon, with their deeply rooted hunter-gatherer traditions, their intimate knowledge of wild resources, their spiritual connection to the land as it was. On the other side, the Yayoi, with agricultural productivity that could support larger populations, with metal tools that were more durable than stone, with social organization built around farming communities. At first, the Jomon probably saw the Yayoi as just another group to trade with, perhaps to intermarry with, possibly to compete with for resources. The rice paddies appeared in western Japan first, in Kyushu, and gradually spreading northeast. The Jomon in northeastern Honshu and Hokkaido continued their traditional lifestyle, perhaps incorporating some Yayoi elements, a few metal tools, maybe occasionally growing some rice, but fundamentally remaining Jomon in culture and identity. But agriculture has inherent advantages when it comes to supporting population. A rice paddy produces far more calories per acre than even the richest forest. A farming family can have more children than a hunter-gatherer family because agriculture provides more reliable food surplus. Over generations, the Yayoi population grew, while the Jomon population remained stable or declined. It wasn't conquest in the military sense, at least not everywhere. It was gradual demographic replacement mixed with cultural assimilation. Jomon people learned farming. Yayoi people adopted some Jomon pottery styles and spiritual practices. There was intermarriage. Over centuries, the distinction between Jomon and Yayoi blurred until eventually the Jomon as a distinct cultural entity ceased to exist. Genetic studies of modern Japanese people show this complex mixing. The Japanese population has ancestry from both Jomon and Yayoi peoples, with most modern Japanese being primarily Yayoi descended, but carrying Jomon genetic markers. The Ainu people of Hokkaido, interestingly, retain more Jomon genetic ancestry than mainland Japanese, which makes sense. Agriculture reached Hokkaido latest and faced more environmental challenges in the colder northern climate. Think about what this transition meant. For the Jomon, it was the end of a way of life that had sustained their ancestors for 400 generations. Imagine your family having done something the same way for 400 generations and then being told, "That's over now. Here's a completely different way to live." The psychological and cultural disruption must have been immense. But it's worth asking, was agriculture actually better for the people involved? Modern archaeology suggests agricultural revolution came with costs. Early agricultural peoples were shorter than hunter-gatherers, suggesting worse nutrition. They had more disease because settlements were denser and sanitation was worse. They worked longer hours. Farming is labor-intensive year-round. They had less varied diet, more dependent on one or two staple crops. And they developed social inequality because agricultural land could be owned, hoarded, inherited, creating classes of wealthy and poor. The Jomon had avoided all these problems. They were taller and probably healthier than early Yayoi farmers. They had varied diet. Their work, while hard, was seasonal and diverse. They had relatively egalitarian social structures. So in many ways, the transition to agriculture was a step backward in individual quality of life, even as it was a step forward in total population capacity and technological complexity. Those of you who witnessed the transformation of American life in the 20th century, from rural agriculture to urban industry, from small communities to mass society, might understand something of this trade-off. More material wealth, more technology, more people, but also more alienation, more stress, more distance from natural rhythms and community bonds. Progress is complicated. The Jomon to Yayoi transition was complicated in similar ways. By around 300 BCE, the Jomon cultural tradition had largely disappeared from most of Japan, replaced by or transformed into Yayoi culture. In remote areas, particularly Hokkaido, Jomon-like lifestyles persisted longer. The ancestors of the Ainu maintained hunting-gathering traditions well into the historical period, creating a cultural continuity that stretched from Jomon times into the modern era. But in most of Japan, the archaeological record shows clear transition. Jomon pottery styles disappear, replaced by Yayoi forms. Stone tools give way to metal. Hunter-gatherer settlement patterns give way to agricultural villages. The change is unmistakable. And yet, the Jomon weren't completely erased. Elements of their culture persisted in Yayoi and later Japanese traditions. Certain pottery forms and decorative motifs continued. Spiritual practices, particularly reverence for nature's spirits, animistic beliefs, connections to specific places, carried forward into Shinto, Japan's indigenous religion. Some scholars argue that Japanese aesthetic sensibility, appreciation for natural materials, asymmetry, understated beauty, has roots in Jomon artistic traditions. The genetic legacy persists too. Modern Japanese people, as I mentioned, carry Jomon genetic markers. Every person of Japanese ancestry has some Jomon ancestors. If you go back far enough, the Jomon didn't vanish. They merged, blended, contributed to the mix that became the Japanese people. Modern archaeology keeps revising our understanding of the Jomon. New sites are discovered regularly. New dating techniques push back the age of pottery, refine our understanding of when different innovations appeared, clarify the timeline of cultural development. Genetic analysis reveals population movements and relationships we couldn't see before. Chemical analysis of food residues on pottery tells us exactly what people were eating. Isotope analysis of teeth and bones reveals where individuals grew up and how their diet changed over their lifetime. Each discovery complicates the picture while making it richer. We now know, for instance, that some Jomon groups were experimenting with plant cultivation. Not quite agriculture, but deliberate management of useful species. Thousands of years before rice agriculture arrived. We know their trade networks were even more extensive than previously thought, stretching across the entire archipelago and possibly to the Asian mainland. We know they had sophisticated astronomy. Some late Jomon sites show stone arrangements aligned with solstices and equinoxes. The Sanai Maruyama site in Aomori Prefecture has been particularly revealing. Discovered in 1992 during construction work, it turned out to be a massive Jomon settlement occupied for about 1,500 years during the Middle Jomon period. The site covered about 90 acres and may have housed 500 people, much larger than previously assumed Jomon villages could support. It had large communal structures, elaborate raised floor storehouses, and evidence of managed chestnut groves. This site alone has forced archaeologists to reconsider assumptions about Jomon social complexity and population density. DNA analysis has been particularly revolutionary. By extracting and sequencing DNA from ancient Jomon remains and comparing it to modern populations, geneticists have traced population movements and relationships with unprecedented precision. This has confirmed the Jomon Yayoi mixing model, but also revealed more complex patterns. Multiple waves of migration, regional variations in ancestry, connections to other Asian populations we didn't previously recognize. The Jomon are also receiving more recognition in popular culture, both in Japan and internationally. They're featured in museums, in television documentaries, in academic conferences. There's growing appreciation that their 10,000-year cultural tradition represents a remarkable human achievement, not despite being non-agricultural, but in some ways because of it. They found a sustainable way to live that worked for an extraordinary length of time. That's worth studying. That's worth respecting. For younger generations of Japanese, the Jomon represent a connection to their deep past, to the original inhabitants of their islands. There's pride in that heritage, interest in understanding these ancestors. Archaeological sites like Sanai Maruyama have become tourist destinations where people can see reconstructed dwellings, handle replica tools, and engage with their prehistoric heritage. And the lessons of the Jomon remain relevant. In an age where we're grappling with environmental sustainability, resource management, and finding ways to live that don't exhaust our planet, the Jomon example offers something valuable. They proved it's possible for humans to live sustainably over millennia, to find abundance without agriculture, to create art and culture and meaning without cities or writing or nation states. Their way of life wouldn't work for 8 billion people. That's not what I'm suggesting. But the principles behind their success, careful resource management, deep ecological knowledge, community solidarity, long-term thinking. These remain valuable regardless of population size or technology level. Those of you who've spent your lives watching humanity's relationship with nature become increasingly fraught, who remember when rivers ran cleaner and forests were larger, who've seen landscapes transform beyond recognition, you might appreciate what the Jomon achieved. They lived in their landscape for 10,000 years and left it fundamentally intact. We've been living in ours for a few centuries, and we've transformed it beyond recognition. Not always for the better. That's not a call to return to Stone Age life. You can't go backward in history, but it is a suggestion that the Jomon had figured out something important about balance, about sustainability, about living within limits. As we face our own environmental challenges, there might be wisdom in looking back at how they managed to make it work for so long. For all we've learned about the Jomon, there's vastly more we'll never know. Archaeology is wonderful for revealing material culture, what people made, used, ate, built. It's less helpful for intangible aspects of culture, language, music, stories, beliefs, social relationships, humor, fear, hope, love. These things leave no traces in the soil. We'll never know what Jomon sounded like. What language did they speak? Was it one language across the archipelago, or many? Did it have any relationship to modern Japanese or Ainu? Linguists have speculated, but without written records or clear descendant languages, it's ultimately guesswork. The Jomon spoke among themselves for 10,000 years, and every word they uttered has vanished into silence. We'll never hear their music. Did they have songs? Almost certainly. All human cultures have music. What did those songs sound like? What instruments did they play? We found what might be flutes made from bird bones with finger holes, suggesting wind instruments. They probably had percussion, drums made from stretched hide, rattles from shells or seeds. But the melodies, the rhythms, the words, gone. Imagine 10,000 years of music, of lullabies and hunting songs and ceremonial chants and love songs, all lost. We'll never know their stories. They must have had creation myths explaining where humans came from, where the world came from, why things are the way they are. They probably had hero tales about great hunters or shamans. They would have had cautionary tales teaching children about dangers. All gone. Every myth, every legend, every family story told around winter fires vanished. The Dogu figurines hint at spiritual beliefs, but we're essentially looking at religious art from a religion we don't understand. Imagine if all knowledge of Christianity disappeared and future archaeologists found crucifixes and didn't know what they meant. They might guess it had something to do with suffering or sacrifice, but they'd miss the entire theological framework, the stories of Jesus, the concept of redemption. That's where we are with the Dogu. We have the objects, but not the meanings. We don't know their personal names, not one. We've excavated thousands of Jomon burials, and we don't know what any of those individuals were called by their families and friends. We don't know if they named children at birth or after some coming-of-age ceremony. We don't know if names had meanings or were inherited These people lived, loved, worked, suffered, succeeded, and died, and we don't even know what they called each other. Those of you who've researched your own family trees know the frustration of hitting walls, records that don't exist, names that weren't recorded, stories that died with grandparents. Now multiply that frustration by thousands of years and hundreds of generations. The Jomon family tree extends back 400 generations, and we can't name a single person in it. We don't fully understand their social structures. Did they have chiefs, councils of elders, shamanic leadership, democratic decision-making, consensus building? We can make educated guesses based on ethnographic parallels with other hunter-gatherer societies. But the Jomon might have been doing something unique that doesn't fit standard models. Maybe they invented forms of social organization we've never seen elsewhere. We'll never know for certain. Marriage customs, coming-of-age rituals, healing practices, conflict resolution, child-rearing philosophies. All of this surely existed. All of it was important to the people who lived it, and all of it is invisible to archaeology. We're looking at shadows on a wall and trying to reconstruct the three-dimensional reality that cast them. Even things we think we understand might be wrong. Our interpretation of the Dogu as fertility figures is educated speculation, but it's still speculation. Maybe they represented something completely different. Maybe different figurines had different meanings we're lumping together. Maybe the meaning changed over time, and Dogu, made in 5000 BCE, meant something entirely different from Dogu made in 1000 BCE. This uncertainty is humbling. We like to think modern science can answer any question, given enough time and resources. But there are questions that simply can't be answered when the only evidence is material remains and the living culture has disappeared. The intangible aspects of human culture, the things that make life meaningful, the beliefs and relationships and stories, these don't fossilize. What we're left with is profound respect for what we can never know. The Jomon were fully human, as intelligent and emotionally complex as we are. They had rich inner lives. They wondered about their existence. They felt joy and sorrow. They had hopes for their children. They feared death and celebrated life. All of that is real, and all of that is lost to us except as abstract acknowledgement. It's worth sitting with that loss for a moment. 10,000 years of human experience, of individual lives lived fully, of accumulated wisdom and beauty and meaning, gone. Not because the Jomon failed, but because cultures transform, languages change, oral traditions die when they're not passed on. This is the normal fate of most human cultures throughout history. Writing preserves some things, but even written cultures lose most of their intangible heritage over time. The Jomon weren't unique in achieving long-term cultural continuity. Australian Aboriginal cultures maintained recognizable traditions for 40,000 years or more, 4 times longer than the Jomon. Some Native American cultures in resource-rich areas like the Pacific Northwest maintained complex hunter-gatherer societies for thousands of years. The San peoples of southern Africa have been in their territories for tens of thousands of years. What these cultures share is interesting. They all developed in environments rich enough to support sedentary or semi-sedentary lifestyles. Without agriculture, they all developed sophisticated ecological knowledge, allowing sustainable resource use over millennia. They all created complex art, spiritual traditions, and social structures without the state-level organization associated with agricultural civilizations. And they all maintained remarkable cultural continuity across time scales that make modern nation-states look ephemeral. They also share another commonality. They were eventually displaced or transformed by agricultural peoples. The pattern repeats globally. Hunter-gatherers occupy territories successfully for thousands of years. Then, agricultural peoples arrive, and within a few centuries, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle has largely disappeared. The demographic and military advantages of agriculture overwhelm the sophisticated adaptations of hunter-gatherers. This isn't a judgment about which lifestyle is better. It's simply recognition that agriculture supports larger populations, and larger populations tend to expand into territories occupied by smaller populations. The displaced peoples aren't less intelligent or less adapted. In many ways, they're better adapted to their specific environments than the agricultural newcomers. But adaptation to specific environments doesn't prevent demographic displacement. What the Jomon and similar cultures prove is that there are multiple paths to human success. The agricultural urban-industrial pathway that most of the world followed isn't the only way humans can organize society. It's not even necessarily the best way for individual human well-being, though it clearly works best for supporting large populations and developing complex technology. The Jomon achieved something the agricultural civilizations around them hadn't: sustainable equilibrium. They found a level of resource use that could continue indefinitely without degrading their environment. Most agricultural civilizations, by contrast, faced cycles of growth, environmental degradation, and collapse. Mesopotamian civilizations destroyed their agricultural base through salinization from irrigation. Many Mesoamerican civilizations faced deforestation and soil exhaustion. Classical civilizations around the Mediterranean deforested vast areas. The pattern repeats. Agriculture allows population growth. Population growth drives intensified resource extraction. Intensified extraction degrades the environment, and eventually the system collapses or transforms. The Jomon avoided this trap for 10,000 years. That's not primitive. That's sophisticated. They'd figured out something we're still struggling with: how to live well without consuming our future. Of course, they had advantages we don't. Their population was small relative to available resources. They weren't facing the problem of feeding 8 billion people. They weren't extracting fossil fuels or dealing with industrial waste. The scale of their environmental impact was inherently limited by their technology and population size. But scale doesn't invalidate the principle. The Jomon proved that humans can live in long-term balance with their environment. They demonstrated that you don't need endless growth to have rich culture, meaningful lives, and successful societies. Those lessons remain valuable regardless of population size. They also proved that humans are remarkably adaptable. The Jomon survived the end of the Ice Age, dramatic climate shifts, population fluctuations, and maintained their cultural identity through all of it. Human adaptability is often talked about in terms of our ability to modify environments, to farm, to build cities, to create technology. But there's another kind of adaptability: the ability to fit yourself to your environment rather than forcing your environment to fit you. The Jomon excelled at that kind of adaptability. Those of you who lived through the Depression, who learned to make do with what you had, who understood that sometimes you adapt to circumstances rather than trying to force circumstances to adapt to you, you understand this principle viscerally. The Jomon lived that principle not as crisis response, but as permanent philosophy. They asked not, how can we make nature give us more? But, how can we live well within what nature provides? Different question, different outcome. In modern Japan, the Jomon have found new relevance. They're taught in schools as the original Japanese culture. Archaeological sites have become tourist destinations and cultural heritage locations. Major museums feature extensive Jomon collections. The pottery in particular has gained recognition as significant artistic achievement, not just archaeological artifact. There's also a certain national pride in having such deep roots. Japanese culture is often portrayed as ancient and unchanging, and the Jomon provide evidence of truly ancient origins. Never mind that modern Japanese culture derives primarily from Yayoi rather than Jomon tradition. The genetic and cultural connection exists, and it matters to contemporary Japanese identity. The Ainu people of Hokkaido have particularly strong connection to Jomon heritage. DNA evidence confirms Ainu have more direct Jomon ancestry than mainland Japanese. Ainu cultural traditions, hunting, fishing, woodworking, spiritual beliefs centered on nature spirits, show potential continuity with Jomon practices. For the Ainu, who face discrimination and cultural marginalization in modern Japan, the Jomon connection provides historical legitimacy and pride. They're not just a minority culture. They're the descendants of Japan's original inhabitants, with roots stretching back 10,000 years. Internationally, the Jomon have gained recognition as part of World Prehistoric Heritage. Several Jomon sites are UNESCO World Heritage locations. Jomon pottery appears in major museums worldwide. Archaeologists and anthropologists study the Jomon as examples of complex hunter-gatherer societies, challenging older models that assumed social complexity required agriculture. The Jomon also appear in popular culture. Japanese anime and manga occasionally feature Jomon themes or characters. Historical fiction imagines Jomon life. There are Jomon-themed restaurants, craft workshops teaching pottery techniques, and cultural events celebrating Jomon heritage. The culture that disappeared 2,000 years ago has been partially resurrected as historical memory and cultural symbol. This kind of heritage revival raises interesting questions. When we celebrate ancient cultures, what are we actually celebrating? The real Jomon lived hard lives by our standards. They faced hunger, disease, injury, and early death far more commonly than we do. Their actual daily reality was probably uncomfortable in ways we can barely imagine. So, when modern Japanese celebrate Jomon heritage, they're not actually wanting to live like the Jomon lived. They're celebrating an idealized version, the artistic achievement, the harmony with nature, the cultural longevity, the connection to the land. That's not a criticism. All heritage is somewhat idealized. Americans celebrate pioneers who tamed the wilderness, conveniently forgetting the diseases, the failures, the displacement of indigenous peoples. Every culture selectively remembers its past, emphasizing the admirable and minimizing the problematic. The Jomon work well as cultural symbols because they represent pre-modern authenticity, harmony with nature, artistic creativity, and resilience. All values that resonate in modern industrial society, where people feel disconnected from nature, from craft traditions, from deep cultural roots. Those of you who remember when craftsmanship mattered, when things were made to last, when people knew their neighbors and maintained ties across generations, you might understand the appeal of Jomon as cultural symbol. They represent something modern life has lost, even if the actual reality of their lives was harder than we'd want to experience. 10,000 years. Let's really consider what that means. If you're 70 years old, you've lived through enormous changes. From before television to the internet age, from pre-atomic to space age, from rural America to suburban sprawl. 7 decades of rapid transformation. The Jomon period was 140 of your lifetimes stacked end to end. 140 times your entire life experience. The mind struggles to comprehend such duration. Consider this. The time between the beginning and end of the Jomon period is longer than the time between the end of the Jomon and today. The Jomon are as far from us as their own beginnings were from their end. That's temporal depth that makes historical timescales look trivial. All of recorded history, Sumer to now, fits comfortably within the Jomon period with room to spare. And during all that time, generation after generation lived lives that mattered. They loved their children. They mourned their dead. They took pride in work well done. They felt awe at natural beauty. They laughed at jokes we'll never hear. They felt fear when storms came. They experienced joy at successful hunts, satisfaction at pottery fired without breaking, relief when winter ended and spring returned. Every one of those lives was as real and important to the person living it as yours is to you. They weren't practice runs for later, more important human lives. They weren't primitive prototypes waiting for true civilization. They were fully realized human existences, complete and meaningful in themselves. 400 generations of people who lived and died never knowing they were part of something we'd someday call the Jomon period, never imagining that thousands of years later, people would dig up their pottery and wonder about their lives. There's something profoundly moving about that. These people are lost to individual memory. We don't know their names, their stories, their specific struggles and triumphs, but collectively, they achieved something remarkable. They lived successfully in their environment for longer than any civilization has managed since. They created art that still moves us. They developed technologies that still impress us. They maintained cultural continuity that astonishes us. That's legacy, even if it's anonymous. Those of you who've thought about your own legacy, who wonder what you'll leave behind, might find something meaningful here. The Jomon individuals are forgotten, but the Jomon achievement endures. Maybe that's how legacy works at scale. The individual fades, but the collective accomplishment remains. Your name might be forgotten, but your contribution to something larger might persist. Or maybe the point isn't legacy at all. Maybe the point is that those Jomon lives mattered when they were lived, regardless of whether anyone remembers them now. Your grandfather's life mattered even if your great-grandchildren won't remember him. It mattered to him, to the people who knew him, to the moment when he existed. Maybe that's enough. Maybe the obsession with being remembered is misplaced. The Jomon didn't build monuments to themselves or write their names in stone. They lived, they did their work, they cared for their families, they participated in their communities, and then they died, and others continued for 10,000 years. There's something almost meditative about contemplating such deep time. It puts our own concerns in perspective. Your problems, whatever they are real and important to you. But the Jomon faced problems too, and they solved them or endured them or were defeated by them. And then their children faced new problems. Life continued, the essential human experience of struggling and occasionally succeeding, of trying to make good lives in a challenging world, of caring for the people around you. That experience united you with those people 10,000 years ago. Different specifics, same basic human situation. Those of you who've lived through war, economic hardship, personal loss, and come through the other side, you know something the Jomon knew. Life is hard, and you endure anyway. You find meaning anyway. You love your family anyway. You take pride in work well done anyway. You appreciate beauty anyway. The Jomon didn't have our technology or medicine or comfort, but they had that essential human capacity to endure, to adapt, to find meaning and beauty despite hardship. That's not a primitive trait. That's what makes us human. And so, the Jomon period ended, not with catastrophe or conquest, but with gradual transformation. The pottery styles changed. The stone tools gave way to metal. The hunter-gatherers became farmers. The villages reorganized around rice paddies instead of fishing grounds. Within a few centuries, the Jomon cultural tradition had been absorbed into something new, the Yayoi, and then the Kofun period, and eventually the Japan we recognize from history. Samurai, emperors, temples, written language, all the trappings of complex civilization. But something of the Jomon remained in the genes of the Japanese people, in spiritual traditions that echo ancient animistic beliefs, in aesthetic sensibilities that value natural materials and asymmetric beauty, in the Ainu people who maintained hunter-gatherer traditions longer than most, in the archaeological sites where their pottery still emerges from the soil after thousands of years underground, in the collective memory of humanity, recovered through careful excavation and scholarly study. The Jomon are gone as a living culture, but they're not forgotten. We've brought them back, partially, imperfectly, through archaeology and imagination. We've given them a name they never used, Jomon, cord-marked, defined by how they decorated their pottery. We've classified them into periods and cultures and phases, imposing order on lives that were probably messier and more varied than our categories suggest. We've tried to understand them through our modern perspectives, which inevitably distorts as much as it clarifies. But imperfect understanding is better than total forgetting. The Jomon deserve to be remembered, even if we can't remember them perfectly. They lived remarkable lives, created remarkable art, achieved remarkable sustainability. They were our ancestors, not genetically for most of us perhaps, but culturally. They were humans doing human things, trying to make good lives in the world they found themselves in. They succeeded for an extraordinarily long time. That's worth honoring. I'm curious what you think about the Jomon now that we've spent this time with them. Does their story change how you think about progress, about civilization, about what humans need to live well? Does their 10,000-year success make you reconsider assumptions about hunter-gatherers being primitive? Or does their eventual displacement by agricultural peoples confirm that progress is inevitable, that one way of life must give way to another? There's no right answer. Historians still debate these questions, but your perspective matters, especially those of you who've lived through massive cultural changes yourselves, who remember when life was simpler, when communities were tighter, when the pace was slower. You've experienced transformation firsthand. How does it compare to what the Jomon experienced? Tonight, we've walked through 10,000 years of human history in a couple of hours. We've met people who lived before pyramids, before writing, before agriculture, and who nonetheless created sophisticated, meaningful, successful lives. We've seen that there are multiple paths to human flourishing, that progress isn't a single straight line, that sustainability is possible if we're willing to prioritize it. The Jomon teach us humility. Our modern technological civilization is impressive, but it's only a few centuries old. The Jomon lasted 40 times longer. They teach us respect for different ways of living. Their lifestyle wouldn't work for billions of people, but it worked beautifully for their population and environment. They teach us that human creativity and artistry aren't products of civilization, but expressions of human nature itself. Those elaborate pots were created by people who'd never heard of cities or states or nations, but who nonetheless felt the need to make beautiful things. Most importantly, the Jomon teach us that humans are resilient, adaptable, and capable of long-term thinking when circumstances demand it. They faced climate changes, resource fluctuations, and the endless challenges of making a living from wild resources, and they persisted for longer than our entire recorded history. That persistence wasn't blind stubbornness. It was successful adaptation, refined over hundreds of generations. As you drift off tonight, maybe think about those ancient people sitting around fires much like the ones humans gather around still, telling stories much like the stories we still tell, loving their children and honoring their ancestors, and trying to live good lives just as we do. The specifics were different. The underlying humanity was identical. They were us 10,000 years ago, wearing different clothes and speaking different languages, but fundamentally the same creatures. Curious, creative, resilient, seeking meaning in a mysterious world. Their voices are silent now. Their languages forgotten. Their songs lost. Their stories untold. But their pottery remains. rising from the soil when archaeologists dig carefully with trowels and brushes. Their tools remain, evidence of skill and purpose. Their homes remain as post holes and hearthstones. Their bones remain in graves they dug for their loved ones. And their legacy remains in the landscape they inhabited for 10,000 years and left intact for future generations. In the quiet of history, if we listen carefully, we can hear the echoes of the Jomon, the scrape of stone on wood, the crackle of fire in pit dwellings, the splash of salmon in rivers, the laughter of children playing in forests that still stand, the careful, patient work of a potter shaping clay into beauty, the whispered stories around winter fires, the songs rising to spirits we'll never know, all gone, all echoing still, if we're willing to listen. If tonight's journey stirred memories, whether your own or stories your parents told you about ways of life that have disappeared, about skills that are forgotten, about the way things used to be made or done, I'd be honored if you shared them below. Your generation holds knowledge of a different world, just as the Jomon held knowledge of theirs. When you pass on, some of that knowledge passes with you, unless you share it. The comment section is yours. Those of you who remember when craftsmanship mattered, when communities were tight, when people knew their neighbors, those memories matter. They're the living bridge between past and present. Just as the Jomon pottery is a bridge between their time and ours. The Jomon are gone, but their story endures. They're not just a historical curiosity or archaeological classification. They're testament to human adaptability, to our capacity for creating beauty, to our ability to live successfully within nature's limits when we choose to. They're a reminder that our way isn't the only way, that progress is complicated, that sustainability is possible. And in the end, they're us, not metaphorically, literally. They're human beings who face the same fundamental challenges we all face. How to stay alive, how to care for those we love, how to find meaning in finite lives, how to leave something behind when we go. They succeeded for 10,000 years. Their pottery still speaks across that vast temporal distance, still moves us with its beauty, still makes us wonder about the hands that shaped it and the minds that imagined it. Rest well and remember, you are the inheritor of 10,000 years of human ingenuity, adaptation, and resilience. The Jomon are part of that inheritance, even if you never knew their name until tonight. Sleep easy, knowing that humans have endured through challenges far greater than what we face, and that somewhere in the deep past, your ancestors, all our ancestors, really sat around fires not so different from the lights you'll turn off tonight, and dreamed of futures they'd never see, futures that became your present. The Jomon walked their path. We walk ours. The journey continues. Good night.